Breaking news tonight, and this is absolutely critical. The Supreme Court has just issued an urgent warning that every single gun owner in America must pay attention to, and whether you carry daily, keep a firearm at home for protection, or simply believe in the Second Amendment as a fundamental constitutional right, what the court is signaling right now affects you directly and immediately. This isn't some abstract legal theory that only matters to lawyers and judges. This is a real-world warning about how your rights are being treated, how laws are being enforced, and how the Constitution is being either respected or ignored by governments at every level. This warning wasn't hidden in footnotes or buried in technical legal language. It wasn't subtle or diplomatic. It was a loud, unmistakable siren directed at lawmakers who are overstepping constitutional boundaries, at prosecutors who are enforcing unconstitutional laws, and at ordinary Americans who need to understand that their rights are under serious threat. For the first time in years, the Supreme Court is stepping in proactively, not waiting for cases to slowly work through the appellate system but instead telling states and lower courts in the strongest possible terms that they are crossing constitutional lines and that these violations must stop immediately. The court is drawing a line in the sand and daring government officials to keep crossing it. So what exactly did the Supreme Court just warn about? Why did they issue this urgent message now? And how will this warning change the future of gun rights, gun laws, and the relationship between citizens and government in America? You're about to find out, and what you learn in the next few minutes could fundamentally change how you understand your constitutional rights and the threats those rights are facing. Stay with me, because this is information every gun owner needs to know right now. Let's start by explaining what triggered the Supreme Court's warning, because understanding the problem is essential to grasping why the court felt compelled to act so urgently. Across the country right now, there is legal chaos surrounding Second Amendment right. Lower courts have been issuing wildly conflicting rulings about carry rights, about bans on certain firearms, about restrictions on who can own guns and under what circumstances, and about how the Second Amendment should be interpreted in the modern era. Many of these rulings completely ignore the constitutional standard that the Supreme Court established in recent landmark decisions like Bruin, which held that gun regulations must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. Despite that clear guidance from the highest court in the land, numerous lower court judges have continued applying old tests, inventing new exceptions, and upholding restrictions that should have been struck down under the framework the Supreme Court established. Multiple states and judges are openly defying Bruin, either because they disagree with it politically, because they think they can find loopholes to work around it, or because they're betting that the Supreme Court won't have the time or willingness to correct every single violation. The ignition point for the Supreme Court's warning came as challenges from gun owners, Second Amendment advocacy organizations, and legal groups piled up, showing a clear pattern of lower courts refusing to faithfully apply Supreme Court precedent. The justices recognized that their previous rulings were being systematically ignored or evaded, and they decided that a strong, public warning was necessary to restore constitutional order. This wasn't just a gentle nudge or a polite reminder. This was the Supreme Court effectively saying in the strongest possible terms, "Enough. Follow the Constitution as we have interpreted it, or we will step in and force compliance." That kind of warning is extraordinarily rare and signals that the court views the situation as a genuine constitutional crisis that requires immediate attention. Now let's talk about what the Supreme Court actually said in this urgent warning, because the specific language and message matter enormously. The court sharply reminded states and judges that the Second Amendment is a fundamental constitutional right that receives the same level of protection as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and other core liberties. They emphasized that historical tradition, not modern policy preferences or subjective assessments of public safety, is the proper standard for evaluating whether gun regulations are constitutional. Lower courts cannot invent new balancing tests, cannot create exceptions based on their own views about what's reasonable, and cannot uphold restrictions simply because they believe those restrictions serve important government interests. The court's warning made clear that states cannot undermine constitutional rights through creative legislative drafting, through emergency declarations that supposedly justify temporary restrictions, or through regulatory schemes that accomplish through administrative action what they cannot accomplish through direct legislation. This wasn't casual or diplomatic language buried in a routine order. The court used urgent, emphatic terms to stress that states and lower courts must stop violating the Constitution, must stop playing legal games to evade Supreme Court precedent, and must stop ignoring clear rulings about what the Second Amendment protects. The warning essentially delivered this message. The Constitution means what we say it means. The Second Amendment protects individual rights. Historical tradition is the test. And if you continue to ignore these principles, we will take cases and strike down your laws decisively. Let me explain why this Supreme Court warning matters to every gun owner, not just to people directly involved in litigation or affected by specific laws. This warning affects how states enforce concealed carry laws, open carry restrictions, storage requirements, definitions of what weapons are legal to own, magazine capacity limits, and even determinations about who is allowed to possess firearms in the first place. The stakes are intensely personal. This could determine whether you keep your carry permit or whether arbitrary government officials can deny it for subjective reasons. This could determine whether the rifle you legally purchased remains legal or whether it gets reclassified and banned. This could determine whether prosecutors can target you for technical violations of complex regulations or whether those regulations get struck down as unconstitutional. This could determine whether new sweeping bans can survive court challenges or whether they get invalidated before they ever take effect. The court is signaling that it will not tolerate states systematically stripping away Second Amendment rights through backdoor restrictions, through regulatory schemes designed to make gun ownership so burdensome that people give up, or through enforcement practices that treat constitutional rights as privileges that government can grant or withhold at will. The constitutional significance of this warning cannot be overstated. When the highest court in America says that your rights are being violated by government officials who are ignoring the Constitution, that means the fight has reached a national breaking point. Now let's identify which states are most likely to ignore this Supreme Court warning, because not every state is going to respond the same way. Some states with strong gun control regimes have been passing sweeping regulations even after Supreme Court rulings clearly indicated that such laws are unconstitutional. Governors and attorneys general in these jurisdictions have been explicit about their determination to maintain strict gun control regardless of what courts say, arguing that they have a duty to protect public safety that outweighs concerns about individual rights. The political drama here is intense because some states are essentially daring the Supreme Court to stop them. They're betting that the court can't or won't take every case, that there will be enough legal uncertainty to allow their laws to remain in effect for years while litigation drags on, or that public opinion and political pressure will eventually force the court to back down. That's exactly why this warning was issued. The Supreme Court recognized that some states have no intention of voluntarily complying with constitutional requirements and that a strong public statement was necessary to put those states on notice. The political split across the country is stark. Pro-Second Amendment states are aligning themselves with the Supreme Court's interpretation, passing laws that expand gun rights and eliminate restrictions that lack historical foundation. Anti-gun states are doubling down, passing even more restrictive laws and essentially challenging the Supreme Court to strike them all down one by one. Let's talk about the legal earthquake this escalating conflict could trigger, because the potential consequences are enormous. If states refuse to comply with the Supreme Court's warning and continue enforcing laws that violate Second Amendment rights as the court has defined them, the justices may be forced to take dramatic action. The Supreme Court could strike down entire categories of gun control laws in a single sweeping decision. They could override state restrictions that have been in place for decades. They could establish strict national constitutional standards that apply uniformly across all 50 states, eliminating the current patchwork of conflicting regulations. This could lead to the biggest Second Amendment showdown since Heller first recognized an individual right to keep and bear arms. We're talking about outcomes that could affect millions of gun owners, that could put dozens of laws on the chopping block, and that could invalidate decades of state gun control policies built on constitutional foundations that the Supreme Court now says never existed. Right now, courts across the country are split on how to handle Second Amendment cases. Some judges follow Bruen strictly, applying the historical tradition test rigorously and striking down restrictions that don't pass constitutional muster. Other judges openly ignore Bruen, continuing to use old balancing tests or inventing new justifications for upholding gun control measures. This judicial chaos is unsustainable, and the Supreme Court's warning signals that they've run out of patience. So what happens next? And can the Supreme Court actually enforce this warning? The court has several powerful options at its disposal. They can agree to hear urgent Second Amendment cases that present clear examples of lower courts or state governments ignoring constitutional requirements. They can issue emergency rulings that block enforcement of laws while full litigation proceeds, protecting rights immediately rather than allowing violations to continue for years. They can strike down laws decisively in comprehensive opinions that leave no room for misinterpretation or evasion. They can clarify the constitutional standards even further, closing loopholes that states have been exploiting and making crystal clear what kinds of regulations are and aren't permissible. Legal analysts who follow the Supreme Court closely believe the justices are preparing to do exactly that. Experts predict the court is getting ready to strengthen the Bruen standard, to shut down states that refuse to comply with constitutional requirements, and to expand protection of individual gun rights in ways that go beyond what they've done so far. There's widespread expectation that the court will take at least one major Second Amendment case in the near future specifically to send a message and to establish precedent that's so clear and so strong that even resistant states will have no choice but to comply. Let me close with a final urgent message about what gun owners must know and understand right now. The Supreme Court's warning is not symbolic. This is not political theater. This is not the justices making a statement for the sake of making a statement. This is a constitutional alert issued by the highest court in the land, warning that fundamental rights are being violated and that government officials need to change course immediately or face judicial intervention. What happens next in this fight will determine how much freedom gun owners actually have in America, not in theory, not on paper, but in real life where laws are enforced, where rights are exercised, and where people face actual consequences for their actions. We are standing at the edge of a massive legal shift. Every gun owner, every state government, every court, and every politician is about to be tested. Will states respect the constitutional boundaries the Supreme Court has established, or will they continue pushing past those boundaries and daring the court to stop them? Will lower court judges faithfully apply Supreme Court precedent, or will they continue finding creative ways to uphold gun control measures that should be struck down? Will the Supreme Court follow through on this warning with decisive action, or will the warning fade without meaningful enforcement? These questions will be answered in the coming months and years through litigation, through rulings, and through the ongoing battle between those who want to expand gun rights and those who want to restrict them. The Supreme Court has spoken. The warning has been issued in the clearest possible terms. And now the entire nation waits to see who listens to that warning and who defies the Constitution despite being told explicitly that violations will not be tolerated. Because the next move, whether it comes from a state passing a new law, from a lower court issuing a ruling, or from the Supreme Court taking a case and delivering a landmark decision, will change everything. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the most consequential chapter in modern Second Amendment history. Stay informed, understand your rights, know what's at stake, and recognize that what's happening right now will shape the legal landscape for your lifetime and beyond. Subscribe so you don't miss the next major development in this explosive constitutional battle, and I'll see you in the next one.